Today, we're going to step into one of the most chilling aviation legends of the modern age, the story of the ghosts of Flight 401. A story where a doomed airliner refused to fade quietly into history, and where its crew seemed to follow. It salvaged parts into the skies once more. Rain hammered against the small cabin windows, each droplet blurring the cold, gray world outside. Inside the plane, the atmosphere was tense, passengers shifting in their seats, glancing at their watches. This wasn't how they'd imagined starting their journey from Albany to Miami. It was supposed to be simple. A quick boarding, a smooth takeoff, for hours later, warm Florida air and palm trees swaying in the breeze. Instead, they'd been stuck at the gate for over an hour, a refueling problem keeping them grounded. Point one of the stewardesses made her way down the narrow aisle, clipboard in hand, counting the passengers for the third time. Something didn't add up. Her eyes scanned the rows until she spotted the issue, a lone man sitting quietly near the front. As she approached, she noticed his uniform. Eastern Airlines. He wasn't listed as part of the crew, so she assumed this must be a jump seat favor. Airline employees sometimes got a lift on company flights. She leaned in politely. "Sir, are you joining us to Miami?" The man didn't move, didn't blink, just stared ahead at a fixed point on the wall in front of him. Confused, she tried again. Louder this time. No response. Her discomfort grew, not just because of his silence, but because of how wrong it felt. Something about the way he sat, so utterly still, made her skin prickle. She signaled for her supervisor, who tried himself. Still nothing. A supervisor decided to get the captain involved, apologizing to the passengers as he led him forward. But when the captain arrived and saw the seated man, something in his face changed instantly. His eyes went wide. The coffee cup in his hand slipped, the dark liquid spilling onto the carpet, because sitting there, in that passenger seat, was someone the captain knew very well. Someone who had been dead for nearly a year. And as the captain stood frozen, the man's features seemed to blur, fade, and vanish entirely, leaving behind only an empty seat. To understand who that man was, we need to go back to the night of December 29th, 1972. It was just before midnight in the Florida Everglades, a vast, dark swamp where the air hung thick and the night sounds carried for miles. Two local men, Robert Markey and Ray Dickinson, had taken their airboat deep into the marshes, as they often did. Fishing rods ready, coolers stocked with beer, they were set for a quiet night. But instead of the hum of insects and the splash of fish, a new sound tore through the night, a deafening roar overhead. Looking up, they saw an enormous tri-jet aircraft descending far too fast. There was no mistaking it. This was not a controlled landing. The jet, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, dropped lower and lower, its port wing, clipping the swampy ground at over 220 miles per hour. The impact ripped the aircraft apart. The wing and engine tore free, the fuselage slammed down and shattered. The cockpit and main cabin disintegrated instantly. Only the tail section remained partially intact, spinning away into the dark. But in the chaos, there was one small mercy. No explosion. The fuel and chemicals bled into the swamp instead of igniting. Markey and Dickinson didn't hesitate. They gunned the airboat straight toward the burning wreckage, dragging survivors from the black water and hauling them to patches of higher ground. Thanks to them, nearly half the people on board lived, though many were broken, burned, and barely conscious. The investigation didn't take long. Flight 401 had been on a routine trip from New York's JFK to Miami International. Its crew were all seasoned professionals. Captain Robert "Bob" Loft, First Officer John Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Donald "Don" Repo, men with thousands of flight hours between them. But that night, as they prepared to land, a small green light on the control panel failed to illuminate. It was the landing gear indicator. They didn't know it yet, but the bulb had simply burned out. The landing gear itself was fine. Still, protocol demanded they check. Captain Loft sent Repo down into the avionics bay to confirm visually. Meanwhile, Loft ordered Stockstill to put the plane into a holding pattern and engage the autopilot. But in moving between positions, Loft's arm brushed the control column just enough to disengage part of the autopilot's altitude hold, causing a slow, unnoticed descent. Stockstill believed they were holding steady. Repo was busy below deck, and outside, There was nothing to see but black swamp, but by the time they realized their altitude had dropped dangerously low, it was too late. The jet slammed into the Everglades. Stockstill died instantly. Loft survived the impact, but was trapped in the wreckage, dying shortly after. Repo lived for a few more hours before succumbing to his injuries in the hospital. Because there had been no fire, Eastern Airlines salvaged many parts from Flight 401 and installed them in other L-1011s in the fleet. And that's when the strange reports began, summer 1973. A senior vice president of Eastern Airlines boarded a flight to company headquarters in Florida. Settling into first class, he was joined by a uniformed pilot, friendly, polite, and clearly from Eastern. They chatted easily until the VP made a passing comment about last year's accident. In that moment, he recognized the man. Beside him, it was Captain Bob Loft, the same Bob Loft who had died in the Everglades. Before the VP could react, Loft's expression shifted, and then he simply vanished. The vice president stumbled out of his seat, pale and shaken. He demanded to leave the aircraft immediately, causing whispers and curious glances from nearby passengers. What could possibly have rattled a man of his stature so badly? He said nothing, just left the plane in a rush. Weeks later, almost the same thing happened again. This time, it was a woman traveling alone in first class. She too found herself seated next to a uniformed pilot. The two exchanged small talk. Nothing unusual, until the pilot suddenly faded from existence mid-sentence. When shown photographs of Eastern Airlines crew members, the woman pointed without hesitation. "That's him. That's the man who sat beside me." It was Captain Bob Loft. As word spread through Eastern's close-knit airline community, more unsettling incidents came to light. That on one flight between Atlanta and Miami, the cockpit crew kept hearing a persistent knocking sound. At first, they assumed it was a mechanical vibration, something loose, perhaps. But the sound had an odd rhythm, almost deliberate. The flight engineer tracked it down to the hell hole, a cramped maintenance space directly beneath the cockpit floor. With the captain's permission, he unlatched the small hatch and shone his flashlight down into the darkness. He froze. Looking back up at him from the shadows was the face of Don Repo. Not a memory, not a photograph. Repo himself, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The engineer slammed the hatch shut, trembling. Repo had been dead for months. In another case, a mechanic working alone in a hangar was approached by a man in an Eastern Airlines engineer's uniform. The mechanic didn't recognize him, but the stranger seemed friendly enough, striking up a conversation about the job. Eventually, the talk drifted to the rumors about Flight 401. The mechanic admitted he didn't know what to believe. That's when the stranger's tone shifted. Looking him directly in the eye, the man said in a low, deliberate voice, "We will never let another Eastern Airlines TriStar be harmed." Before the mechanic could respond, the man vanished. Later, when shown a series of crew photographs, the mechanic identified him instantly. It was Don Repo. These stories were impossible to contain. Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, even executives whispered about the sightings. Some employees flatly refused to fly on any aircraft containing salvaged parts from Flight 401. Eastern Airlines leadership tried to keep things quiet, worried about public panic. But the sightings kept happening. And then came the incident that forced their hand. Flight 903, another Lockheed TriStar, was en route from JFK to Mexico City. Stewardess Faye Merriweather was mid-service when she glanced toward a passenger window and froze. Don Repo's face was staring back at her from the other side of the glass. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to blink. To look again. He was still there. Only when she called another stewardess over did the face fade away. But her terror didn't end there. Minutes later, sitting in the galley trying to compose herself, Merriweather heard a disembodied voice whisper, "Watch out for fire on this plane." Heart pounding, she hurried to the cockpit to relay the warning. The crew checked every system. Nothing. The flight landed safely in Mexico City, but on the return trip to JFK, the starboard engine began smoking. Fire spread along the wing before the crew extinguished it. They landed safely, but now the pilots wanted answers. When they learned their aircraft contained parts salvaged from Flight 401, their expressions said it all. With pressure mounting, Eastern Airlines finally acted. Orders went out. Every salvaged part from Flight 401 was to be identified, removed, and destroyed. Once the last component was gone, the sightings stopped. No more apparitions of Loft or Repo. No more whispered warnings. And perhaps most haunting of all, no Eastern Airlines TriStar was ever involved in another accident until the company ceased operations in 1991.